And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. I apologize. Now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sayyid al-Rais.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, once again, the rostrum of the General Assembly is being manipulated flagrantly by some Western country for their own geopolitical interests. These countries are increasingly fostering polarization between UN member states. These countries used the request for this resumed special emergency session. They have used it to present a draft resolution to the General Assembly that's even more hostile towards the Russian Federation after having the two resolutions in the Security Council. Member states have not had the opportunity to introduce amendments to the draft resolution that we have before us today. This draft resolution constitutes clear proof that these countries purely want to take a hostile stance against the Russian Federation through an erroneous unidimensional view of what's happening. This hostile, provocative approach taken by these countries, this approach shows us that these countries are trying to fuel the conflict and to push to one side neo-Nazism in Ukraine rather than resolving issues through dialogue and negotiation. We condemn what the Western states are doing in the media and whipping things up against the Russian Federation. This includes fake information, false news, falsified images. So trying to prevent the Russian Federation from taking steps to prevent the threats posed to its own people, which are upheld by the UN Charter. The UN Charter, sir, that was drafted 75 years ago by the founding fathers in good faith, over recent years has been exploited in a selective, erroneous way. This is through a double standards principle. Countries which are railing against the Russian Federation today and are criticizing it for wanting to protect its own border, those are the same countries that launched aggressive attacks against my country using the pretext of defending their national security, despite the fact that my country is tens of thousands of kilometers away and presented no threat to them whatsoever. The US and the countries of the so-called international coalition have destroyed whole towns. They've killed thousands of citizens, such as was the case in the town of Raqqa. Thus, these states have no right to shed any tears or to preach to anyone else because these states have no credibility whatsoever. Mr. President, I am sure you're aware that after the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russian Federation recognized the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Russian Federation extended its hand to its partners, including Ukraine. Ukraine should have respected the historical and geographical truths. The Kiev authorities should have abstained from taking measures and using reprisals against the Russians in the LPR, the DPR and in Donetsk, they should have respected good neighborly relations. The Ukrainian authorities, after the 2014 coup, adopted negative, dangerous policies against their Russian neighbor. These policies have sought to denigrate everything that brought together the Ukrainian people. Political leaders and extremist political parties in Ukraine, with the support of the West, sought to warp the historic memory of the Ukrainian people. Extremist nationalist movements have used this situation to fuel animosity against the Russian Federation. Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, that each and every day we hear some Western countries pontificate about the need to hold people responsible for particular events occurring? Nonetheless, these countries themselves say nothing against the movement of nationalists in Ukraine. It goes without saying that NATO states have been involved. They've played the role of instigator. They have provided numerous promises to nationalist extremist movements in Ukraine. They promised to incorporate Ukraine into NATO and the EU. They promised Ukraine military assistance if it upped its aggression against Russia. The US and its allies, including in NATO, have clearly instrumentalized these policies. They have covered up the inhuman, discriminatory practices of the Kievan regime against the people of the DPR and the LPR and Russia-speaking people in the Donbass and elsewhere. These people over the past 8 years have suffered terribly. So these people finally chose liberation. They chose to become part of the Russian Federation. My country appreciates the Russian Federation's efforts to guarantee stability and security of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. Russia also is hosting tens of thousands of refugees, is providing humanitarian aid, and is opening up humanitarian corridors. It's also accepted that vessels containing grain and agricultural products leave Ukraine. My country will vote against the resolution on Ukraine proposed by Albania. This is resolution L5. Here, we're not talking about voting against transparency or the action of the GA. Rather, we want to understand the level of pressure exerted by Western countries against member states to highlight the animosity against the Russian Federation. This is why we reject this approach. We would caution other delegations against such trends. We would urge them to refuse these efforts to isolate Russia and to employ double standards. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic